Hey, deserving listeners, I want to tell you something. Attachment theory is the most important theory in my life. I use attachment theory with my clients. I use it with my personal life. I use it to interpret other people's behavior. I use it to interpret my own behavior, my own emotions, my reactions to other people. Every regrettable thing I've ever done can be elegantly and thoroughly explained through attachment theory. It explains so many things that I've done when I've thought, geez, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Why did I hurt that person's feelings? Well, why did they hurt my feelings? Why did I overreact in that moment? Attachment theory explains it all. It explains so many things about the human experience. Childhood development, psychopathology, personality disorders can be explained easily through attachment theory. Anxiety, depression, complex PTSD, and research has looked into the connections between these things, and I'll get into that in this deep dive. Eating disorders are explained through attachment theory. Divorce, conflict in marriage, bad parenting, good parenting can be explained through attachment theory. Attachment theory explains why therapy works itself, why any relationship works to make us feel better. Attachment theory, it could be said, explains why this podcast helps people. Why listen to this podcast as opposed to one of the other thousands of other podcasts? Attachment theory explains why people fight with each other, why groups of people fight over random things on the internet, why nations fight with each other, why we like rom-coms, why we like reality TV shows, why we like this sort of TV shows where they will do an act on stage, like sing a song, but we need to hear the backstory. Attachment theory explains all that. Attachment theory explains why we feel bad when our spouse is distant from us, feels distant, explains why we feel bad. Attachment theory explains why we get angry at our spouses, why our spouses get angry at us. It explains why we grieve when we lose someone. And attachment theory even explains why people think about or even attempt suicide, and so on. It explains everything, in my opinion. And every day, because of this, I think about attachment theory because it helps me with almost everything I do. It helps me understand myself and other people. It helps me navigate relationships with other people. For example, last night I was playing a show with my band, and we're on stage, and we're a Strokes cover band. I'm in another band. I'll spare you the details, but one of the bands I'm in is a Strokes cover band, and the Strokes they sound sort of simple, but they're actually hard, especially for the guitarists. We have two guitarists, and each of them have solos that they play, and some of the solos are actually kind of hard. And so one of our guitarists was playing the solos, and I knew it's always like he's always on the edge of screwing up, but most of the time he pulls it off really well. But last night when we were playing one of the songs, he screwed up the solo pretty horribly. I mean, I think he improvised well enough that I don't think anyone noticed, but everyone in the band was like, oh, he's losing it. And without attachment theory, I probably would have reacted to that in a destructive way. Or I might have, if I didn't think about attachment theory because I did last night after he made the mistake on the solo, I thought about attachment theory and how it could help me understand what was happening. Because if I didn't have that, I probably would have tried to act like I didn't notice that he made a mistake on the solo. If he came up to me afterwards, I'd be like, oh, I didn't notice, even though I totally did, which he might have interpreted as, oh, he's just saying that because clearly there's no way he could not have noticed. Or without attachment theory, I might have tried to subtly tell him that he needs to practice more or something, because I would have been overly focused on the performance, if that makes any sense. But with attachment theory last night, I know that I have part of my reaction is based on my feelings. I'm observing this bad solo happening, and a lot of meanings are associated with that. I could interpret that as he's not putting in enough effort into this band, which made him, which resulted in him making a mistake with the solo. And that could mean that he's not really dedicated to his relationship with me. That's where attachment theory really helps us. It's like a lot of things are interpreted on an attachment bond basis. And him making a mistake on a solo, particularly if I'm sensitive to attachment injury, I might have a circuitous route to interpreting him doing a bad solo to him basically rejecting me. And this wouldn't be conscious, of course, but it would be potentially happening. And this could make me feel hurt. It could make me feel angry, which could make me want to punish him somehow. So instead, with attachment theory in my mind, I put that aside, even though I had minor inklings along those lines. And I resolved to not see things that way, which helped me to relax and also to approach him better. I also knew through attachment theory that because he made a mistake with the solo, he was probably panicking from attachment worries for fear of being rejected by me and the rest of the band because he messed up the solo, right? So he messes up the solo, and it makes him afraid of being abandoned by me and the band, because that's a viable thing that could happen if one of the band members is totally just not performing well. It's conceivable to someone that they'd be like, oh, maybe I'm on the chopping block. Now, our band is so casual that would never happen, and the guys are amazing. I mean, I'm by far the least talented member of the band. So if anyone should be kicked out, it should be me. But anyway, but that's a real fear that people would have. And I suspected that he might have at least, some inklings of that, which could make him feel demoralized. And then maybe he would feel less happy about being in the band. And then he would quit the band, which is not what any of us want. So, and by the way, this happens with bands all the time. Attachment injuries happen within bands and lead to them breaking up, like the Beatles and so on. It explains things even on that level. And when I look at the Beatles, because I'm such a huge Beatles fan, and I'm watching Let It Be and the breakup of the Beatles, all I can think about is attachment theory, about John Lennon and Paul McCartney and Ringo and George for that matter. And then Yoko comes in, and it just the attachment movements within the band led to the inevitable breakup. And if I was to keep them together, I would have gone back and tried to actually help them with their attachment with each other and to help them understand what's happening, and so that they can optimize their attachments and potentially stay together, because I really love the Beatles. Anyway, in the end, last night, as I'm thinking about this in the midst of doing all the other things last night, instead of trying to gloss over it or punish him or give him a message like, hey, you should probably practice more or something, in the end, I decided, well, what do I really want out of life? And I thought, well, the most important thing to me about being in the band is to have fun and to bond with my bandmates. And so, because I know that that's the most important thing, and that being perfect is definitely not important to me, although being perfect would be great. It'd be awesome if people in the audience were just like, oh my God, that is a perfect band. Of course, that would never happen, but that seems intellectually like a great thing, but understanding through attachment theory tells me that that is meaningless compared to the meaning and well-being that I get from strong attachment bonds cultivated over time with people that I trust, i.e. my bandmates and everyone else in my life. So in the end, after we were packing everything up and getting off the stage, he turns to me and he apologizes. He turns right away. He's like, I'm sorry I screwed up that solo. And I reached out with I think I might have hugged him or, put my hand on his shoulder and said something like, oh man, don't worry about it. It was cool. And I said something to the effect, which was true, that in his screw up, he tried to improvise his way out of it. And it actually probably went over well with the crowd. But anyway, so I said something along those lines. But my primary goal in that interaction was to soothe him and tell him that he's safe with me, that our bond is strong, and that I'm not going to reject him, and that I appreciate him and his apology or something. It's about the bond. It's about that feeling of security between two people that really matters so much to us. And without that, bad things happen. For example, the next time he's on stage and he's gearing up to play a difficult solo, if he feels secure in his relationship with me, he's less likely to be anxious and therefore more likely to nail the solo, right? And the opposite is true. If he's about to play a solo on stage and he's really worried that he's going to get kicked out of the band or even just emotionally rejected by me, if he screws up, then that raises his anxiety and makes him more likely to screw up the solo. So in the end, the attachment theory and the bond actually gives us a lot of what we want, not just in guitar solos, but in marriage, in relationships, in parenting, in coworkers, in the meaning of life, in grief, in death, in internet activity, in podcast activity. Like everything comes together, I think, when we look at things through attachment theory. It's just this wonderful guide to life I have found. So, with my wife, for example, it's just so important. Like almost every interaction I have with my wife, I filter through the attachment lens when I need to think about it, particularly in times of conflict or tension. Parenting issues, always through the attachment lens. With my students, with my coworkers, with my clients, I'm almost always thinking about attachment theory when I'm working with my clients. With my supervisees, not only when I'm teaching my supervisees how to do therapy, I'm teaching them the attachment theory lens, but I'm also wanting to cultivate an attachment with them, because when my supervisees feel safe with me, they're much less anxious. They're much more likely to share things with me. I actually write about this in my book, Multi-Role Clinical Supervision. I have a section on attachment and all the research that demonstrates that when the attachment is secure between supervisee and supervisor, a lot of good things happen, including better client outcomes. And when supervisors don't focus on attachment, you could argue that it's unethical, because there's actually research showing that if you don't pay attention to the attachment, it is more likely to lead to bad outcomes for clients. So by ignoring attachment in the supervisee relationship, you might be harming clients in the end on average, So there's just a lot of things like that. When I interact with listeners to the podcast, I do this podcast for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons, and I've always said this, is the community that I feel, the community that it feels to me. That's a really bad syntax sentence, and what does that mean at the base level? What it means is basically the bonds that I have with all the listeners that I'm in contact with, some of them more so than others. If this was just a cold thing that I did, and it was, I was just like going to talk in this microphone and teach a few concepts and move on with my life, then it wouldn't really have the resonance in my life or the meaning or the purpose or the motivation. And when I think about it through an attachment theory lens, then I think, okay, well, what am I doing here on this podcast? Well, one of the things that I'm doing, among a number of things, is I am bonding with you, the listener. And that helps me to feel like I'm in the zone when I am embodying that mission. And it feels worth it to me, right? And I think that and for people who are into that style of podcast, they get something out of it. Anyway, so attachment theory informs the podcast. It really just informs all my interactions with everyone I've interacted with. And so it helps me to find happiness. It helps me to give happiness and well-being to other people. It's just such a powerful thing. So that's what this series is going to be about. This is part 1 in the attachment theory deep dive. More parts will follow. I'm going to break it up. In the past, I would try to do deep dives in one fell swoop, one big episode, but this time I'm going to do different chapters, essentially. And so I'm not sure how many chapters are going to be, but this is chapter 1. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about, or not in this chapter, I'm going to talk about the history, John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, and others. Because when we understand the history of attachment theory and where it emerged from, I think it helps to explain the theory itself, but also how it fits into our society and our profession. But in other parts, I'm going to talk about attachment theory itself. Obviously, I'm going to have a whole chapter just to attachment theory, which is pretty complex. Attachment theory is interesting because it's simple. It can be very simply explained. It's not like psychoanalytic theory where it takes a while to even get the basics. Attachment theory, lay people can understand it very easily with just reading a few sentences, honestly. But it is also extremely complex, or deep, I should say. That's what makes a good theory, right? Is when it's fairly easy to comprehend, particularly because it's so human and so real and so relatable to people that as soon as I talk about attachment theory with clients or students, they're just like, oh my God, yeah, I get it. And also, you could study attachment theory for your entire career and never run out of things to look at because there's so many different things to unearth. So I'm going to talk about attachment theory itself, all the attachment styles, and through that, you listeners might be able to determine your attachment style and the attachment style of people around you, because I think that's one of the most useful things you could ever learn is your own attachment style, the different signs of that attachment style, the development of that attachment style, and how to recover from that attachment style, and the attachment style of other people. I can't tell you how useful that is to understand for your spouse, your clients, your coworkers. It's just mind-blowingly helpful. I'm going to talk about lots of research. I have been working on this deep dive for months, and it always, I thought I would not take this long, but it has taken a long time. And I have read hundreds, maybe over 1,000 studies. I've read several books on attachment theory, and so I'm going to review a lot of empirical research. I'm going to talk about social media and attachment, Facebook. I'm going to talk about different measures of attachment theory. How do we measure your attachment style? How do we look at pornography? Pornography and attachment have been researched quite a bit. Couples therapy, obviously, a massive, important element of any qualified couples therapist is to understand and utilize attachment theory. Also, using attachment theory in general with all clients, I'm going to talk about. One chapter is just going to be about therapy using attachment theory. I'm going to talk about the brain and biology. I'm going to talk about mirror neurons and mentalization and development. Parenting. I'll probably do a whole chapter on parenting. How do you parent your children in a way that is optimal for attachment? Because attachment is related to so many things in life, it is critical that parents know how to properly attune to their children. If you raise your child in a way that is focused on attachment in a good way, in a competent way, you can lower the risk of so many things in your children. So many things: eating disorders, depression, personality disorders, divorce, problems with drugs and alcohol. So that's a whole other thing, is attachment is related to drug and alcohol abuse, because of course it is. Once we get into the theory, all this will make sense. You'll be like, well, of course attachment theory is related to these things because of the understanding that we get of our development in relation to attachment. I'm going to talk about personality development and psychopathology in general. Society and culture and our physical health is also related to attachment theory, and many other things. So this episode and the series of episodes on attachment are for patrons only. I apologize if you're not a patron, but honestly, if you've ever thought about becoming a patron of the podcast and you've been waiting for that one thing, I think this is the time. This series might be the most important thing I've ever done on this podcast, truly. I can't believe it's taken me this long to do it. I've been doing the podcast for over 10 years, and it's taken me this long to do an episode dedicated to attachment theory. I think the reason why was because I never wanted to do a half-assed job. I wanted to make sure that I did it right, and it's taken me 10 years to gear up to get to this point. And so if you've thought about being a patron, I encourage you. Of course, it's up to you. So if you're not a patron, you have to go to patreon.com. That's patreon.com, and become a patron of the podcast there. And then you'll be given instructions on how to access these episodes on attachment theory and this many other deep dives that we've done. So do so now.